Hi, this is Alex Bryant. Welcome to our panel discussion here on the US China tariffs. We've got a very large number of people signed up for this topic, so we'll jump right on into it. The focus here really is going to be discussion of the US China tariffs, as well as expansion of tariffs and the other tariffs which came out yesterday. East West is very happy that we partnered up with the US China Business Council for this webinar, and we'll be doing subsequent webinars with their premier organization. They'll explain who they are here in a minute, but we'll dive right into it. We'll have a hard stop at 12 o'clock. The way we do these, for those who are new to our webinars, most of this is spent on Q&A time, Q&A sessions. So we'll get through part one and part two within 15 minutes, and then we'll move to a brief discussion on the tariff survey, the preliminary report on that, and then get into the Q&A. We'll have 45 minutes of that. So for housekeeping purposes, everyone here can ask questions. You can ask questions throughout the whole event. If you go to control panel on the right side, click questions and send the questions in, we will get those. We've already got a long list of questions that people sent in prior to today. So we have those questions. Anyone asks a question, we'll get to that. If at the end of the session, and sometimes this happens, we run out of time on questions, we'll respond back to you very quickly, either in person or on a phone call to get to you. So please feel free on that. Secondly, this webinar will be recorded and then sent to you, and also put on our website. So you'll get this presentation and you'll have the recording. Okay, brief introduction to East West. We'll make this quick. Alex Bryant, president of East West. Here are our core 4 areas we're focused on supply chain and manufacturing. And we are based in China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, and Poland, and Eastern Europe. Our core practice is around manufacturing footprint, supply chain footprint, operational commercial performance, supply chain, and human resources and risk management. Regarding tariffs, these are kind of the 5 services our clients are asking us to help them with, whether it's feasibility studies to identify suppliers, identify sourcing companies, identify third-party contract manufacturers, some closures in facilities, particularly in China, and consolidating, supplier identification, qualification, transition, identification, qualification of third-party contract manufacturing, and then plant relocation, the move facility. So it's all built around supply chain and manufacturing. Here's where we're based, where our people are based, in the US, Mexico, Central Europe, China, and Southeast Asia, those 5 locations. Here's a brief list of our client base, sampling of that. All right, so now we're going to move into the introduction of US China Business Council and today's speakers. So I'm going to turn over to Kyle Sullivan, who's with the US China Business Council. Kyle, if you would introduce yourself, and then Mark and Dan follow up after that.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Great to be here. As Alex said, my name is Kyle Sullivan. I'm with the U.S. China Business Council. I'm based in Washington, D.C. Previously, I'd lived and worked in China for about 12 years. I've been working on U.S. China commercial trade policy for about almost 20 years now. I'm very much looking forward to our discussion today. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. This is Mark Plum. So I've been in Asia since 1992 through 2014. I was president of Briggs & Stratton, president of Trane Air Conditioning. Since 2014, I've been with Alex, and we're working on a lot of businesses in China, in Thailand, moving them around, et cetera, et cetera. So long time in Asia. Dan?
Yep, Dan McLeod. I've got a background in engineering and manufacturing management, and spent the majority of my career in Asia, split between China and Southeast Asia, where I do everything from oversee design and construction of new facilities, hiring, staffing, startup of new facilities, supplier development, and develop supply chains in the region. I've been working with Alex for about 7 years now, and again, continuing to do supply chain and manufacturing improvement projects, but not just in Asia, but also in Mexico and Europe as well.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to turn, Kyle, I'm going to hand it over to you, and you can provide a background, if you would, on the US China Business Council.
Yeah, just real quick. So USCBC, we're a nonprofit trade association. We're headquartered in Washington. We've been around for 51 years. We have offices in Beijing and Shanghai. We represent U.S. multinational companies that operate in China. We have about 270 member companies, nearly all of which are American firms. We do not represent Chinese firms. We have a few UK companies, European companies, but our kind of principal objective is to build a beneficial U.S.-China commercial relationship. We provide policy advocacy, advisory, and conferences and meetings to our member companies. We have, I would say, pretty unparalleled access to both governments. In recent years, we had hosted Chinese President Xi Jinping in San Francisco in late 2023 on the sidelines of APEC. And then just last week, our board chair, Mr. Raj Subramaniam, who is the CEO of FedEx, he led a delegation of over 40 CEOs to meet with President Xi Jinping in Beijing. Just a quick, down the next slide, you can see it, just some of the companies that we work with. This is our board of directors. We have 40 companies on our board, chaired by FedEx. Some of the board companies I believe are clients of East West Associates. I see Corning on there. So we're principally working with kind of the larger companies. They span nearly all sectors of the economy: manufacturing, industrials, healthcare, life sciences, services, semiconductor, you name it. Some of America's most iconic brands are within our membership.
Thank you, Kyle. And I will say that East West, when we were putting this together, we specifically chose US China Business Council because they've got such a breadth of knowledge in Beijing and in Washington. And they're also active politically within Washington and Beijing and trying to affect policy. And so I thought we thought at East West, that's going to be pretty relevant for today's discussion. Okay, we've got briefly, we're going to move into a tariff survey. East West has sponsored a tariff survey. A number of you have filled it out. We're closing it, I think, July 10th, and we'll provide a full report. But we thought relevant to today's discussion, we pulled out 4 charts, which we think are relevant to where companies are looking at the tariffs and how they're responding to it. Obviously, the first question was how it's affecting your business. The primary areas of concern, obviously, cost increases are number 1. By the way, you could select more than one. That's why the percentages average over 100. Obviously, cost increases is number 1 and supply chain disruptions is number 2. That's not a shock. Here's about what people are planning on doing. This was pretty interesting. The first one, exploring non-Chinese and non-tariff suppliers that you would expect, right? That's 62%. 48% are exploring new manufacturing in non-tariff locations. 60% were going to move forward, maintain what they're currently doing, and wait and see over the next 6-12 months what happens. I think that what we're seeing, if you look at the first one and then this third one, the 62% are exploring it, and 60% are holding. But you've got a lot of these companies, while they're holding and doing wait and see, they're also exploring non-Chinese or non-tariff suppliers, third-party contract manufacturers, exploring new operations as kind of a plan B and a plan C. Obviously, more than half want to renegotiate competitive pricing. 84%, not surprising, want to pass it on to their customers if they can. 12% are planning on closing or downsizing their China operations, right? And then lastly, 52% are going to be evaluating their global manufacturing supply chain footprint to map out a longer term strategy as we get a better handle on these tariff situations. So next question was around, where are you considering non-Chinese suppliers and third-party contract manufacturers? Southeast Asia obviously was picked up. The 70% was in Southeast Asia. The U.S. interestingly was second at 34%, and Mexico was third at 26%. But we thought that was quite interesting that the U.S. is coming in second and closely followed by Mexico for building out a non-Chinese supply chain base. Then not surprising, Southeast Asia is number one. And then lastly is where you consider relocating your China-based manufacturing operation. For the 53% that are looking at relocating that, Southeast Asia was number one at 42%, followed by Mexico at 14%. So those are kind of briefly where the companies who have signed up, who completed the survey, was, I think we emailed that to, we had like 300 that were we contacted. This is kind of where they are currently parked. If you have not completed the survey, we'll get it to you and ask you to fill it out. The deadline is next Friday, the 10th, the next Thursday, the 10th. Okay, so now let's move to the Q&A session, which is really what the East-West webinar is all about. So we're want to get into these questions. Now, again, if you have questions that pop up, please feel free to ask questions. We've already gotten 4 since the start of the webinar, and we've already got questions ourselves. So let's jump right on in. I'm going to ask Dan if you would kind of briefly explain on the China piece and then move into the questions.
Sure. Again, many folks out there now have been firmly entrenched in China for many years, for the last 20 years or so. And this has been, in recent years, this has been quite a challenge to look other places for a manufacturing base. China is much more invested in manufacturing and infrastructure. You won't find anything similar anywhere else in the world. But you may be able to, depending on what industry you're in, there are certainly other opportunities in what are generally considered developing or low-cost countries for sourcing and manufacturing. When we've looked at it with our folks on the ground in these various regions, and we asked them to evaluate, where do they find their region to be particularly strong? Where do they see most activity around new sourcing activities? We've laid it out in this way. If we look at both manufactured products and industries supporting them down the left, and then we highlight which countries we find to be good fits for that. Anywhere where you see Mexico in the far left, we've got a variety of industries there, all the way through Poland in the middle, CEE. You've got another strong industrial base, metalworking and stamping and metal fabrication industries, and then in Southeast Asia as well. So
that's great. Thank you, Dan. All right, so we're going to move now into getting Kyle, if you would talk first, really around what happened yesterday, right, from the US China Business Council, really what happened yesterday, and explain that and explore that, and then we're going to be diving off questions from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Alex. So yeah, April 2nd truly was an extraordinary day in the Trump administration's first 2 or 3 months in office, and I think it was an extraordinary and very impactful day for any company that has overseas business operations or has commercial relationships with countries outside the U.S. And I have to admit that the reciprocal tariff announcement greatly exceeded our expectations, and I think the expectations of many of America's trade partners. And so just to kind of summarize quickly, so for anyone who's not been paying attention, President Trump yesterday announced that he will use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to address large and persistent trade deficits with all of America's trade partners. And as a result of that, the White House had imposed reciprocal tariff rates on 57 countries that have the largest trade deficits with the U.S. And on the right side of the slide, you can see a snapshot of some of those countries. that have large trade deficits with the U.S. And for each of them, there's a reciprocal trade tariff rate on the far right column. These tariff rates will go into effect on April 9. And for countries that do not have specific reciprocal tariff rates, they will also be subject to a 10% kind of universal baseline tariff. So essentially, every trade partner with the U.S. has new tariffs coming into effect either this week or next week. And for some countries, those tariff rates are as high as, Vietnam is 46%. But for our purposes, and the region that I cover, China, the new reciprocal tariff rate is 34%. And if anyone's reading the kind of White House fact sheet, you'll notice that these reciprocal tariffs are additive, right? They're cumulative in addition to any tariffs or customs duties that are already applied. So for China, the math is a bit tricky, right? And it certainly depends on the specific product that you're importing from China. But just a kind of back of the envelope calculation, you have several different tariffs that are already in effect, and those include the 301 tariffs that were imposed in 2018, 2019. You have the 20% tariffs that the White House had announced in January and February, and now you have this new 34% reciprocal tariff. So taken together, it looks like the weighted average tariff rate for Chinese imports will now exceed 70%. And that is just absolutely astronomical. You can do the math yourself. You can understand the cost implications for your company. And certainly the intent is really to kind of disincentivize more production in China and to incentivize production here in the U.S. And we'll get to that a little bit more. I just want to speak a little bit more about how these tariffs interact with other tariffs. So you have the 301 tariffs, you have the 20% IEEPA tariffs, you have these 34% reciprocal tariffs, and then in addition to that, there are sectoral tariffs, namely these Section 232 tariffs that the president had already announced for autos, steel and aluminum, and other sectors. The good news is that the sector-specific tariffs are not additive, right? So it's going to take a little bit for importers. You're going to have to do your own calculations, where you're going to have to refer to the HTS codes of your specific products to understand specific customs duties. So it's hard for me to say exactly how this will affect everybody individually, but suffice to say that it's going to be a major cost for you. So just a little bit on the kind of the politics. So I think there was significant debate inside the White House about how to best unveil and roll out these tariffs. I think there are kind of two camps inside the White House. One camp would characterize as kind of the hardliners. That's led by Peter Navarro, who is President Trump's special advisor on trade and manufacturing. And then you have kind of the more, I would say, market-oriented individuals. That's Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. That's the U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer. Then clearly the hardliners had won out in this debate here. But perhaps the silver lining is that the ultimate arbiter, the ultimate decision maker, will be the president himself. And in the White House fact sheet that was published yesterday, that makes that explicitly clear that the tariffs are subject to change if these countries, including China, take reciprocal actions to reduce their own tariffs against U.S. Exports and to reduce, kind of non-tariff trade barriers that inhibit the American firms from conducting business overseas. And what I expect, and we can get to this in the Q&A, but I expect there will be, kind of one-on-one bilateral negotiations with these trade partners. Perhaps some of the smaller countries the president will address first, and then once those issues are addressed, the White House probably will turn its attention to China, which has much trickier issues that are at play here. So I think perhaps the last thing I'll mention is that the executive order yesterday also reduces the de minimis, the so-called de minimis loophole. So presently, under U.S. Customs policy, any small package that's imported from China and has a value of $800 or less is currently tariff-free. But starting on May 2, those small packages will also be subject to at least a 54% tariff. So a lot of the kind of the small retail items that are coming from China through Chinese e-commerce platforms, right? Those will now be significantly more expensive for U.S. consumers. And the White House initially had tried plugging this de minimis loophole a few months ago, but they had some difficulty with the enforcement side of things. Now it seems that the CBP, Customs Protection and Customs Border Protection, have gotten their ducks in a row, and now they're able to enforce the de minimis, the removal of the de minimis exemption. So overall, I think it's probably this is the nuclear option that the president exercised. It really caught a lot of folks off guard, particularly the Chinese. And I'll be happy to discuss what the implications are for U.S.-China trade negotiations and what China's reaction might be in subsequent Q&A. Thank you.
Sure. And while we're on this, I think just a question. We're also, obviously it was noted that Mexico and Canada are not on this list, right? So as I understand, Kyle, correct me if I'm wrong, as I understand, the original 25% that Mexico and Canada had, that's applicative now, but there are no reciprocal tariffs on Mexico.
Is that correct? So the treatment of Mexico and Canada is a bit unique. I think that the good news is that the exemptions under the USMCA are still valid. Prior to the Trump administration taking office, I believe the average tariff rate for USMCA qualified products was 2.5%. President Trump subsequently increased that to 25%, but as a result of yesterday's announcement, that rate has gone back down to 12%. But that's only applicable to USMCA qualified products. And to be a USMCA qualified product, there are certain content of origin requirements, local content requirements embedded in that. So again, it's not as straightforward as just a simple tariff rate. It just there are conditions attached to it.
Right. Okay, so we now we'll start moving through the questions we've gotten. Serious questions already popped up. We just had a question. I'll go back to this slide. We just had 4 questions pop up. One was a question about is the question from manufacturer that manufacture in China. So the China tariffs is in addition to the other tariffs, and the answer there is yes. This is additive. So as you pointed out earlier, it's a 34% plus a 20% from this year, and then the earlier tariffs from the first administration.
Correct.
And second question was comes from manufacturer Missouri, saying is the Venezuelan oil tariff also in place?
So that's a really good question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, sir. That was a question.
So thank you for raising that. It's unclear at this point, but as I think many on the line are aware, the U.S. has threatened to impose an additional 25% tariff on any country that purchases crude oil or any hydrocarbons from Venezuela. China is a major purchaser of Venezuelan oil. So theoretically, under this order, China could be subject to that additional 25%. The path forward on that is still unclear. We understand that the Secretary of State Marco Rubio may travel to China in April this month to speak with his Chinese interlocutors on a range of issues, including Venezuela. But that's a political discussion, and it remains to be seen how these Venezuela tariffs would be factored into the reciprocal tariffs. I suspect that if the U.S. decides to levy the Venezuela-related tariffs on China, they would be additive as well. So it really plays into the president's strategy, which is to apply maximum pressure to trade partners in order to gain concessions from them. And then hopefully those concessions will suffice or satisfy the White House's requirements, and then perhaps some of these tariff rates will come down. But I don't want to get ahead of myself. That's our current thinking, but it certainly is subject to change because there's lots of volatility right now, and things are changing very rapidly.
Yeah, I do know that that's a great point. It is changing rapidly. We do know that India committed to not, after that 25% demand from the president, in the Indian pulled out of Venezuela. And that was one of the side effects that India pulled out. Okay, so we had two questions on the Venezuelan oil. Had a question here about, can we expect the EU to act quickly with reciprocal tariffs on U.S. goods? EU came out at 20% yesterday, which is pretty high. So obviously no one knows exactly any of these countries are going to do, but looking at the EU or any of these countries, is your thinking, Kyle, that there's going to be a lot of bilateral trade negotiations occurring as a result of this?
Yeah, the EU is a really unique and special case because they are just such a large trade partner with us, and the president seems to have, I would say, special concerns about the EU. This dates back to 2018 when the White House then had imposed tariffs on steel imports from Europe and other countries. So then there are lots of politics involved here. So I don't want to speculate about Europe. I think I can surmise that negotiations between the U.S. and Europe will be trickier than, for example, U.S.-Vietnam negotiations or U.S. Brazil or Malaysia, right? It's just because there's a lot of baggage here.
Fair, and a lot of actors involved. Another question popped up. We've got a client here in Minnesota that said they're manufacturing in China and India. Based on the April 22nd tariffs, what are the total import tariffs for these two countries? I think you've already addressed that for China, right? You talked about it's 34 plus 20, it's 54 plus it goes up to potentially 72%, right?
That's right. So again, that's a weighted average. There are several ways to calculate this, but I would say right now, starting April 9, the kind of minimum tariff would be around 70%.
Right, and for India, I think you're looking at the 26% that we have from yesterday. All right, we have another question popped up. Question then from another client, this is a manufacturer here in North Carolina, said Vietnam, Thailand, and India deemed to be great option to move manufacturing from China. Vietnam, Taiwan, Thailand, and India, great option to move manufacturing from China. Consider this new reciprocal agreement, would they reach China's tariffs? And And I think the answer there is no, because the question is Vietnam or Taiwan or India or Thailand ever going to be as high as China's tariffs?
It's hard to say. I think, like a lot of observers, was very surprised that the levy against Vietnamese imports was, I believe, 44%. So, but yeah, I think that's fair to say that the tariffs against Chinese imports are motivated by a range of concerns, right? These tariffs are really kind of the main feature of our trade policy towards China. And it's going to be very difficult for the US to walk back the tariffs against China in particular because of the prevailing mood here in Washington, D.C. about the perceived threat that China presents to U.S. national security and economic security. So I suspect that again, what I said earlier, the White House will be open to discussions with its major trade partners and is looking for these trade partners to reduce their trade barriers, their market access barriers, their tariffs, which hopefully will inspire the White House to lower our reciprocal tariffs. I expect that to be kind of the priority now. And then again, once these other trade partners are addressed, then the White House will hopefully have focused its attention on China.
Right. So we'll kind of jump into the answering all these other questions that are coming in so quickly, but let's jump into some of the questions that the residents asked beforehand. What are the next steps for the Trump administration's tariff strategy? I think you talked about that the ideas are looking to address some of through bilateral negotiations with some of the other countries before they tackle China in its entirety. Is that correct?
That's my assessment currently. Absolutely.
All right. And what about the impact for future U.S. China trade negotiations? Where do you see that?
So that's a great question. I mean, it's these negotiations, I think, really have been complicated by the yesterday's Liberation Day. Just on China's reaction, because that certainly plays into this question. We're still waiting for China to retaliate. They certainly will retaliate. But I think that it's probably dampened the mood, or the mood in China is, I think, is very pessimistic. They're not very hopeful that they can reach a kind of a grand bargain with the U.S., similar to the Phase 1 agreement that the U.S. and China had signed in January 2020. The Chinese, they themselves are not optimistic that we can do a similar kind of Phase 2 agreement. And the tariff announcement yesterday, I think, probably will just reaffirm their suspicions of the U.S. America's intentions toward China. So, but I think there's still a desire to at least enter into negotiations with the U.S. And because the Chinese, these tariffs are going to be fairly painful for their export sector. The export-oriented economy in China is a major employer. And the employment situation in China is not very good right now. The economy is not growing as fast as it used to. And I think that these tariffs are just complicating their own domestic economic agenda even more. So I guess theoretically there would be an incentive for the Chinese to try to negotiate a deal with the U.S., but there's just really no trust right now, and that's just a result of years and years of just a bad relationship, right? So that's kind of my take right now, but I'm happy to go into more detail.
Well, I mean, I think we're talking further. Like, the question here on the fourth question down about we've talked about this before, the China tariffs seem to be more systemic in nature, right? They're from the administration, and that's less likely to change. It is the one issue that both Democrats and Republicans seem to agree. Trump put his tariffs on China, Biden came in and did the same. So, and now Trump's added additional ones. So that seems more systemic in nature. The administration's talked about looking at China because they are the word of them from a national security issue. When you look at the tariffs from on Southeast Asia or Mexico or Canada, they seem to be more tactical in nature. Do you see that? Do you see do you see China's being more specific, Southeast Asia, Mexico, Canada being more tactical in nature, thus more likely to work out some agreement, bilateral agreement, if that's possible?
I think that's fair to say, Alex. Let's take Canada and Mexico as an example. I think that, I mean, there were political objectives to the president's tariffs against both countries. For example, he wants Mexico to do more to address the border issue, and he wants Mexico and Canada to do more to address the fentanyl issue, right? A lot of fentanyl chemicals, precursor chemicals, are produced in China, and they are shipped to North America via Canada or Mexico,
Right.
primarily Mexico, where they are processed into illicit fentanyl, and then the fentanyl is sent to the U.S. and it's causing a major social and public health crisis here. And the president is very focused on interdicting the fentanyl trade, and so his tariffs against Mexico and Canada initially, and China, were aimed at fentanyl and the border. So, but to your broader question about just the China tariffs being more systemic, yes, that's absolutely correct, because this is at least the third iteration of China tariffs that we've seen, fourth iteration, I'm sorry, since 2018. And once tariffs are in place, especially for China, it's very politically difficult to roll them back. No policymaker in the U.S. is going to go on the record and say these tariffs on China are bad, they're misguided. It's just, there's no upside for a congressman to do that, but there's upside for Congress people to say tariffs against Canada are bad, and we saw that yesterday in the Senate.
Right. What has here, another question popped it. This one was here's a manufacturer says, considering the new tariffs, do you see labor rates in Southeast Asia countries potentially changing from where they have been? Mark, why don't you tackle that? Dan, why don't you comment on that?
Yeah, let me talk a little bit about that. And also some of the other, and Kyle's right, some of these other tariffs on other countries are really a message to China. Vietnam is one of them. The message to Vietnam is, let's start building products in Vietnam and not transshipping stuff from China, and substantially transform your products there. Then once that's, I think, agreed upon and done, you'll see those duties between Vietnam and USA become a little more not as much. Thailand, of course, has a great relationship with the United States. It's got a treaty of 150 years. Yeah, there's an imbalance right now because we buy a lot of ag products and we don't ship a lot of stuff there, but not many other places that we can buy pineapples and shrimp and rice from, right? So that, I think, is going to be worked out, and we're already in discussions with the Thai Board of Investment. Thailand really wants good relationships with the states, so I think we're going to see some bilateral there. In case of labor rates, those of you who've been around China and Vietnam, particularly for China, that it's market driven. The top down says this year it's 10% labor increase, and you pay your employees 10% labor increase. Thailand is dramatically different. It's a market economy, and your labor rates are based on what the market will bear, and they've only typically in the last 10 years had increases 2-3-4% a year. So the economy drives labor, and the market, I should say, drives labor in Thailand, where politics sometimes drives labor in China, certainly in Vietnam. Philippines is more market economy, of course. That Malaysia is more market economy. But those any command economies, it's top down driven.
You see with the labor rates out these days, you see them, the potential change, but it's really going to be based on the economy, except for Vietnam or.
Yes, certainly Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia. It's market driven, and these countries. I mean, they you know we know Thailand, as everyone knows really quite well, and they are aggressively trying to claw business back that they lost to China, 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. So yeah, and a lot of policies that they're putting out now, whether it's inexpensive labor or it's incentives, or if it's transparency or it's back office. It's very aggressive.
That's a good point. A question here in the top of this page as well about China's response. I mean, Kyle, can you talk a little bit about what was China's response to the 10% in January, 10% in March, and then what you think, just your future projections of how they can potentially respond to this new 34%?
No, thanks for the question. It's a very good one, and it's China's response is drawing a lot of attention from our member companies. So let me just go quickly back to the first trade dispute with China in 2018, 2019 time period. And anybody who was doing business then, who was following events then, they would have noticed that when the U.S. had imposed tariffs against China, there were four iterations of tariff increases during 2018, 2019. So the Chinese had followed a very strict playbook of responding to tariffs in a very reciprocal fashion. So the U.S. they increased tariffs by 20%. We increased tariffs by 25%. The Chinese would respond the next day, increasing tariffs by 25%, and so on and so forth. So it's very much an in-kind reciprocal response. The landscape now is dramatically different, right? China is much less dependent on trade with the U.S. than it was 7 years ago. China has a whole new suite of policy tools that look a lot like America's policy tools that they can use to retaliate. They have new export controls. They have new blacklists that they can put American companies on. So they have a much more potent and, frankly, creative toolkit that they can use. So the response to the first 20% hikes in January, February, the Chinese had really showcased what they're capable of doing. So, for example, when President Trump announced the first 10% increase, the Chinese, they did some reciprocal responses. They tariffed just a limited number of products. So agriculture machinery, vehicles, things like that, manufactured goods, and they did it in a very clever way. They really struck companies that are in red states, right? These, ag is a very much that's part of President Trump's core constituency. So they're very politically, I would say, savvy when they responded. They also put a bunch of critical minerals from China on their export control list. So they want to stymie or interdict US China trade in critical minerals that we need for manufacturing here in the US. They also launched investigations into prominent American companies such as Google and NVIDIA, the semiconductor firm. So they did a whole range of actions, right? And then they did the same thing when right after President Trump announced the second round of 10% hikes. So fast forward to today, the Chinese have yet to formally retaliate. They've made some rhetorical statements. They called on the U.S. to quickly cancel the reciprocal tariffs. They called the tariffs blackmail. So they've said all these things, but they haven't really taken action yet. But I suspect that they will certainly. There will be a forceful response from China. They might give it a few more days to see if the president changes his mind, right? I mean, history is a guide, and the president changed his mind on Mexico tariffs a month and a half ago. So the Chinese are just waiting for further signals, but I suspect in very short order, we will see more U.S. companies being targeted in China. We will see more export restrictions, and I think we'll see more tariffs on U.S. exports to China. But apart from that, I don't want to speculate on specifics.
Right. It is fair to say that for the non-China countries, right, that are out there, the Indians, the Thais, Vietnamese, Israelis, they're going to be focused really more on bilateral agreements of trying to, but we already see what the Thai Prime Minister came out with this morning. You see the same thing with the Israeli government, same thing with some of these other governments. They're coming out and trying to pretty quickly negotiate a one-off deal or a bilateral agreement with this administration.
Yeah.
And you see more of that happening. And then the China thing is going to be much bigger. That one and the EU are much bigger challenges that will take longer.
It's difficult for China to make any quick announcements about, hey, we're going to reduce market access barriers for American companies. So they are already making these announcements, right? And I think the prevailing attitude in Beijing is anything that we do to appease the U.S. will not be recognized by the U.S. Therefore, there's little incentive for us to do anything more to appease the Americans, right? But let me just add a caveat to my previous comment about China's retaliation. So this whole time, China's been careful to avoid escalating in a severe fashion, and I think they'll continue to have that instinct to avoid escalating in a severe fashion because they still want to see how things play out. It is in their interest to address trade tensions with the U.S., but they're not going to bend over backwards for the Americans, especially now because they are very frustrated with I think they're frustrated with the way that the U.S. administration, not just the Trump administration, but the previous Biden administration, how they went about doing things. They're very frustrated with the U.S. actions. And so there are political considerations in China. It's not a democracy, but they have their own, they have 1.3 billion constituents as well. And they cannot look soft in the eyes of the public there.
That's a very good point. Yeah. So as we turn to kind of thinking about the tariffs and thinking about the situation, and now how the effect it has on all the companies that have signed up today in registration and all the companies that are operating in China and elsewhere around the world. Mark and Dan and Kyle, what can a U.S. manufacturer do to prepare for an area of uncertainty? I mean, we know a lot of companies are kind of planning or trying to develop Plan B and Plan C. But what can a manufacturer? What do you see manufacturers doing now that you're talking with? Mark, you can take.
Yeah, this is Mark. So yeah, I mean, people have to really look at the content of their business. So a lot of people and a lot of clients that we have are using kind of a China plus one, right? They're in China and they continue with a facility in China to supply their clients and customers in China, and then they begin to look outside of China for maybe another facility that's going to feed back, say, to the USA or other ASEAN countries. And then they look at, they come to people like us or other for like feasibility studies. Where could they go for the right land, the right labor, the right leasing, the materials, components, ease of doing business, trade relationships, domestic markets, all that kind of stuff, incentives. And then they begin to develop a list of places that maybe, hey, let's take a look at this. There's incentives there. There's good labor base there. There's good components there. There's good. It's pretty easy to do business. It's transparent. They've got good trade relations with the United States. So that's what a lot of people. And then depending whether they're just buying a component, well, they can look to another country to buy that component, or they're having a third party manufacture maybe a little more sophisticated product for them, not off the shelf. Well, then they can then look for other countries, based on the feasibility study, to be a third party contract manufacturer. Or if they're really concerned about, IP theft and they have a really high-tech product, then adding an additional wholly owned foreign enterprise to what they have in China to one of these other countries, depending on, and then going through the whole list of 10, 12, 15 matrices that would lead you to where's the best place for you to go based on the feasibility study. So there's a variety of things based on your particular mode of operation, whether it's as little as sourcing a widget to having a third party make a very sophisticated product for you, or you building the product yourself in a wholly owned facility.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about, I know you just working on one now, about a third party contract manufacturer, and you'd sent me some of the results of that. You just talk about like how they did it, how that company out of the Midwest.
Yeah, so sure. A company in China was a U.S. Midwest company, had a contract manufacturer. Actually, they were really building it more themselves in China, but they really wanted to go more asset light. They didn't really want to own all those assets, so we helped them find. In this case, it was Vietnam. We looked at Thailand and the Philippines as well. A third party contract manufacturer that could produce a very sophisticated product for them, a $20,000 piece of equipment, and a lot of IP, a lot of technology. So, you go out there and you find, well, who else can do this stuff? And then you go, you meet with these people and then find out, can they do it, and do they want to do it? And can you control the IP? Do you have the right trade relationship? Do they have the right technology in house? And we happened to find a company that was building more of a retail or a less commercial kind of product, and they wanted to move into more of the commercial, more high technology product that our client was using. So it was really a perfect match. So, and then now they've moved this facility. They've moved away from a wholly owned to a third party contract manufacturer, and really gone asset light. So it's pretty successful.
And that's on the sourcing side. Yeah, and I think whether that's in Southeast Asia, Mexico, Europe, or even coming back to the US. I mean, I think one thing that was interesting, we were talking about supply chain earlier, we saw from the survey that companies are first to diversify their supply chain. We talked about they were first going to Southeast Asia, right? Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia. And then after that came the US and Mexico. And Dan, can you talk a little bit about, you did some work with a firm looking at kind of comparing US to Mexico, right? Because what they were trying to do, it was really more of a North American play. Kind of talk about that, because I think from the survey, it sounds like more companies now are either trying to bring it back to the US or trying to bring it back to Mexico. As potentially an alternative to going to Southeast Asia.
Right. Yeah, and this is a company that was in the consumer product, outdoor lifestyle sort of products, pretty high value, and but and a bit complex to manufacture. So they were evaluating whether their existing facility was getting old, and they were faced with the need to significantly invest in it to keep it up. But so they wanted to look at other options for relocating, and we worked with them to evaluate in the U.S., in the Southeast U.S., and in Mexico. And what we found is in their particular manufacturing process, where the finished product was quite bulky, so you had high logistics costs, and they required a significant amount of natural gas and utilities to run their operation. We found that there really was an overall financial incentive to going to Mexico, and the Southeast U.S. was very competitive. Mexico obviously had the labor savings and tariff avoidance from USMCA, but it was very dependent again on the manufacturing process. Someone that's making a smaller, less freight intensive product, or one that's very labor intensive to manufacture, found Mexico to be a great fit, and big advantage over the U.S. But there are exceptions to that, certainly.
Interesting. I think we'll see more of we're seeing. I think as we're going through this, companies are continuing their trying to figure out how to diversify supply chain, diversify manufacturing, and they're going to be continuing to develop their plans to do that, whether it's Southeast Asia, Mexico, or the U.S. But I think, Mark, when you're talking, I mean, when you and Kyle also, when you're looking at these countries, and these countries are saying, all right, I'm looking at Thailand, I'm looking at Mexico, I'm looking at Southeast Asia, I'm looking at Europe. Where are they supposed to go now, right? During this period where it looks like there's going to be a lot of horse trading, a lot of negotiating for companies. I mean, do you expect companies to kind of stop and wait, pull back, and just kind of wait and see where this goes? Or companies kind of continue exploring, like, where could I diversify? Where could I relocate operations to? But do the evaluation, do the exploring of it before taking action.
Well, I think a lot of them, and they can do it rather quickly. And really, it's not that is, do the feasibility studies to kind of, okay, we're not doing anything yet, but if we were to do something, where would we do it? And then go out and look, take 4 to 6 weeks and look at all the metrics of, 3, 4, 5 different countries. As I said, working through all those, see, and then begin to rank where you might want to go. Based on and during that time you may see some of these bilateral trade agreements be coming out. I think and I think Kyle mentioned it too. Some of them are going to be quite quick because of their relationships with the states and their percentage of business of exporting to the states. So so you could do your homework, do your studies, do it pretty quickly. It doesn't cost this doesn't take that much time, and then during that time, things may, over the next 4 to 6 weeks, you may see some clarity as far as the bilaterals.
Yeah, I think that makes it, and that's kind of what we're seeing, right? Companies are going ahead with development of that plan B, that plan C.
Yeah, that's right.
So here's another question popped up while we're talking. Question, will orders on the water arriving after April 9th that are purchased prior to the new tariffs, will they be subjected to the new tariffs? How you may want to take that one if you know the answer.
No, I'm happy. So there is a goods on the water exception for the reciprocal tariffs. My understanding is that the reciprocal tariffs will not apply to goods that are on the water and headed to the U.S. before the tariff goes into effect. So remember that there are 2 types of tariffs announced yesterday. There's the reciprocal tariff for 57 countries. Those tariff rates are different for each country. And then for the rest of the world that does not have a specific reciprocal tariff, there's a baseline 10% tariff. And the baseline 10% tariff goes into effect April 5, while the reciprocal tariff on the 57 countries goes into effect April 9. So any good that is on a boat right now headed to the U.S. And if a boat is, it disembarks tomorrow on April 4, it will not be subject to the tariff rate, right? So you got a couple days here.
All right. Thank you. Now I know we've got it's 12 noon, so companies have to hop off. That is totally fine. We've got a few more questions that have come in, and 2 questions here on this page that I want to get to. One, which was, how does the tariffs that are placed on China now, right? How is that going to affect those companies? Obviously, if they're sourcing over there, whether they're, Mark, to your point earlier, whether they're sourcing widgets or they are sourcing from third-party contract manufacturers, they're going to be trying to diversify that supply chain, right? Because they've got to get the tariffs are now at almost unsustainable rates. But how does that affect a company that has an existing manufacturing plant in China? I guess the difference if you're selling in China or you're not selling in China.
Yeah, if it's, again, as I mentioned, kind of the China plus one, if you're selling domestically in China, then of course there's, you're not not crossing borders. And then if you are exporting, well, then you have an HIS code to what you're bringing out, whether it's a component or a finished good, and then it's going to fall under the categories that Kyle's been talking about.
Yeah, I think it's good. It may be pretty rough for those who have plants in China and that are having a heavy percentage of export. I'm trying to bring that back.
Well,
to
yeah,
the
I mean,
US.
yeah, I mean, but a lot of those guys have over the years. I mean, a lot of people, there's a lot of people that went to China, chase cheap labor, built, or source something and ship it back to the States. Well, that person is in a very dire situation, but and you got to mitigate against that, right? So.
Absolutely, yeah. We had a question pop up. This from Manufacturing Minnesota. They are in the process of kind of relooking, reevaluating their supply chain and their manufacturing. Right, they got facilities. It says in China, India, France, and the U.S. And they're trying to reevaluate where they are. I assume they're trying to, doesn't say it, but I assume they're trying to get closer to their customer. We've worked with that for a number of companies. Dan, you kind of led that last project. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we were working with a client that had, over the years, they had bolted on some businesses, and so their footprint had changed over the years. Their customer base was almost entirely in North America, but they were manufacturing and sourcing in China. They were manufacturing in Southeast Asia, both in Thailand and Vietnam, and also a very substantial, large operation in the U.S. So we worked with them to really model their current footprint, understand material flows, cost flows, relative productivities, and came up with modeled that and came up with several options for them and worked through the evaluation of that. And this included outsourcing a significant portion of their high volume internally produced product to suppliers in Mexico. They had a very efficient operation in Vietnam that appeared to be a good platform to build a manufacturing and sourcing operation in Southeast Asia. In China, they early on, this was the tariffs had come into effect, and so in China we looked at whether they should maintain or shut down the operation, and that decision was made to shut it down, and that happened effectively. And then also in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, where they had redundant operations, that was consolidated and made the operation more efficient and able to be managed with a single management team there, essentially. So there was a fairly significant undertaking to reconfigure their global footprint on this one.
And interesting, and that makes they're doing that because they're trying to plan. They did this before all the tariff situations, but it looks like it's going to work out for them. But they're trying to get, in that case, they were trying to get close to their customers. We have one other question I wanted to get to here, which was asked about Kyle, the tariffs, right? And it talks about the opinions of whether they're temporary or permanent. In other words, right now they're through executive orders. What's the likelihood this stuff it becomes law and therefore requires act of Congress? Or will we expect for us to see more of these executive orders on tariffs?
That's a really good question. So just there's lots of appetite in Congress to reevaluate China's permanent normal trade relationship status, and I don't want to go into a college level seminar here on trade policy, but when China joined the WTO, the U.S. as part of their WTO accession, the U.S. granted MFN most favored nation status to China, which lowered tariff rates on Chinese imports. And as part of that process, the U.S. granted PNTR status to China, right? And PNTR status ensures before the first trade dispute last decade, China had enjoyed the tariffs on Chinese imports were similar, if not equal, to all other countries that have PNTR or MFN status. So now, fast forward to today, many policymakers in Congress want to repeal China's PNTR status, which would theoretically send tariffs to up to 60%. But it doesn't even matter anymore because the tariff rates now, the effective tariff rate is higher than what would be the tariff rate if we repealed PNTR status. So I think that, it's difficult to say. I'm not a legal expert, but the authority that the president used yesterday to announce these tariffs is called IEEPA, and I mentioned it earlier, International Economic Emergency Powers Act. It grants the president, sweeping authority to impose trade policies without the approval of Congress. They are unilateral, but it's tricky for the White House to rely on IEEPA all the time. And our expectation was that before yesterday, he would not use IEEPA to impose tariffs on every country because we thought it would be legally tenuous and it would invite lawsuits. That still might happen. It's possible. But I think that with the president's proclivity to negotiate and to extract concessions from trade partners, hopefully the tariff rates will go down and these tariff rates will not need to be codified into law. But with China specifically, at this point, it kind of, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but the president, he would prefer probably not to codify tariffs into law because he fashions himself as a negotiator, right? He believes that he is the most capable negotiator inside his administration, and he does not want Congress to tie his hands, right? So if Congress were to cast a vote and statutorily revoke China's PNTR status and codify tariffs into law, then that would reduce President Trump's negotiating leverage and ability to negotiate with China. So that's my assessment there.
A fair question. All right. Well, look, I know we're already almost 10 minutes over. So I want to thank everybody for staying for this webinar today. We had 45 minutes on a little more great questions. That's the way the East-West webinars go with this kind of roundtable discussion. So I want to thank Kyle Sullivan from the US China Business Council. I want to thank Mark Plum, Director of East-West, Dan McLeod, Director of East-West. And again, everyone will be getting to your questions. I know there were a few we weren't able to get to. We'll be responding in email or phone calls, and you'll be getting a copy of this recording. So thank you very much for participating, and we will look forward to you joining us for the next EWA webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.